Hello and welcome to our Shriver Hangout for November 2015. My name is Amanda Moore, and I'm the Director of Online Content and Communities at the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law. And I'm very happy to have with me today Sharon Dietrich. Sharon's the Litigation Director at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and she's joining us today from Philly. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Amanda. How are you?
Doing fine. And I'm in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Sharon wrote an advocacy story for us earlier this year, and that was published here at this URL you see on the Clearinghouse community. It was called Preventing Background Screeners from Reporting Expunged Criminal Cases. And that's what we're going to talk about with her today. But first, I want to tell you how you can be part of our conversation. We really want to hear from you. We welcome your questions, your anecdotes, comments, whatever you would like to share. And there are two ways you can do that. One is if you're watching us through the Google Hangout itself, you can take your cursor and hover it over the left side of your screen, and you'll see a little icon pop up there. It's blue and it says Q&A in it. Go ahead and click that, and you'll see a chat box open down the right side of your screen, and you can submit your questions to us that way. Don't worry, you won't appear on screen or anything like that, but we will be able to see your questions and answer those promptly. If you'd like to go ahead and try that out, feel free. You can send us your name and where you're watching and get those channels of communication open now. And I wanted to go ahead and say a special welcome and hello to our viewers in Arkansas. I was able last month to attend the Legal Services Conference there in Arkansas, and it was a great group of people, a bunch of wonderful advocates, and I noticed a lot of them signed up for today. So I want to say a special hello and welcome to them. The second way that you can send us your questions today is through Twitter. You can tweet to us. Here's a handy hashtag, Shriver Hangout, and we're at Shriver Center. So we would love to hear from you that way as well. All right, now to the real substance of today. Sharon, I want to start out with a very basic question for you, and that is, can you explain to us briefly what you mean when we talk about expungement and its value?
Sure. Actually, in many states, what record clearing is not called expungement. Different states have different labels that they put on the process of eliminating a criminal case from public view. It could be called sealing, it could be called set aside, could be called expungement, but essentially the idea is to take a criminal case out of public view so that employers and landlords and others are not relying on that case in order to make decisions about that person. This is a really critical reentry strategy, because many of the strategies that we have for helping people reenter deal with having the decision maker, like the employer or the landlord, make a fair and legal decision. But of course, if they don't have at all a case to consider, then that case is not going to be held against the person, and it's not going to require that employer or landlord to apply the rules of law correctly and fairly. So recognizing this, about half of the states over the last 5 years have expanded their expungement laws, and I'm just going to refer to record clearing as expungement for purposes of keeping things simple here. But half the states have expanded their expungement laws because they recognize that people need a fresh start. And I'll just add quickly that we have a next generation coming that I'm very excited about. Rebecca Vallis at the Center for American Progress and I wrote an article that we talked about something called Clean Slate, which would allow people to have their cases automatically sealed by technological resources rather than having to file individual petitions. And that is starting to be rolled out, and we think that's going to be an extremely powerful tool. But only if the private background screeners also remove those cases from the background reports that they prepare for landlords and for employers.
So how is it that that doesn't happen?
So when a background screener prepares a report, they typically are not going to the public source for fresh data. And let me say that most background check reports are prepared from data put out by courts. Now, here in Pennsylvania, you could check that instantaneously because our court records are online. That's true in many states. But that's not how they do it. What they do is they have purchased data in bulk, possibly from a middleman company that purchased it from the original public source, the courts, and they're running a background check against that data. So if that case has not been eliminated from the data that these private entities hold, even though the court itself may have removed the case from its information, it will remain in that data and it will be reported as a case that still exists. So it's sort of a technological snafu, but it's exacerbated by the fact that in many circumstances, the data holder cannot run a refresh, an update from the court data that's coming into them and realize that a case that was already there has been removed. So because of these technological reasons, even though your courts may have taken your case out of their data, your background screener or the 500 background screeners around the country may still all have access to that case.
Well, I want to remind our viewers that we would love to hear your questions. And I want to say hello to Caleb at Colorado Legal Services. He sent us a note to say he's watching. For those of you who have tuned in later, I wanted to tell you, you can submit a question through the Q&A app. You can hover your mouse over the left side of the screen and open that up, the Q&A box, and send us a question that way. Or you can tweet to us at Shriver Center. Sharon, one of the things that you talked about in your advocacy story that I mentioned earlier is using the Fair Credit Reporting Act as a tool to fight these expungements that keep reappearing, or criminal records that aren't actually expunged, which may sound a little funny. That's a consumer protection statute. So how is it that that can help with this problem?
So the FCRA applies to consumer reporting agencies that put out consumer reports. Those are legal terms. And so happens that they're defined broadly enough that background check reports are generally covered by the FCRA. And there's not even any dispute at this point by the industry that that's the case. So given that you have statutory coverage, there then are two important legal requirements that are put on the background screeners. The first is under what FCRA lawyers call Section EB. It's 16K Section E paren B. And it requires that background screeners use reasonable efforts to assure maximum possible accuracy. It's not a strict liability standard, but still they have to do what they can within reason to try to get things right. And the second is a claim that arises under Section K, 1681K, that says that either for employment-based reports that are going to be used for background screening for jobs, either the background screener has to transmit the report to the subject of it instantaneous to when they provide it to the employer, or they have to use strict procedures to make sure that the report is complete and up to date. So that standard applies only to employers, but or situations where background checks are bought for employers, but it's even a more imposing legal requirement. So that is the basis to require the background screeners to remove these expunged cases. And the industry basically admits that the law requires them to remove these cases. But what they often say is, we can't identify these cases. It's difficult for us to know that cases have been expunged from the public data. And our difficulty is to figure out how to get these cases out of there.
Well, that brings me to something you have in Pennsylvania that's pretty unique, I think. It's called the life cycle file. And tell us about that.
So this is a mechanism that you all want your state courts to adopt. And while it has got this fancy name, the life cycle file, it's sort of a glorified list. And the Pennsylvania courts, after they got a lot of calls from people who had expungements from the courts, saying, my case is still coming up in background checks, what is wrong here? They decided that what they would do is prepare a file that is essentially a list of expunged cases that they require their bulk purchasers and everyone who uses that bulk data downstream to run against their data to remove the cases that have been expunged. So in essence, it is a computer file that does something that doesn't have to be done manually. But the really, I think, simple idea is for the state courts to give a list of the cases that have been expunged to the data brokers so that they can take the cases out.
So how would do you have any recommendations for our listeners and viewers in other states, how they could take steps to start that process of getting something similar to a life cycle file in their states?
I think it's as easy as trying to start a conversation with your administrative office of courts. That's where this innovation came from in Pennsylvania, the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts. AOPC is justifiably proud of having devised this solution, and they're very willing there to talk with other states that would be interested in doing the same.
Well, that's great. Some of us who live in other states would look to that definitely as a model and hope that it would be as well received in our states. The advocacy story that you wrote for us, and I'll remind our viewers that after this Hangout, everyone who registered will receive an email, and we'll have a link to the recording of this Hangout, and we'll also put a link in there to Sharon's advocacy story to make that easy for you to access. In that piece, Sharon, you focused on the Gideon's case, a case that you worked on. Could you tell us a little bit about that? We put this sort of in a more concrete case study.
Sure. So Mr. Gideon's was a client of mine who I represented in expungement court, got his expungement, verified that it had been totally implemented, and waved goodbye and wished him good luck. And 20 months later, after the expungement had been complete, he came back to me on intake, and I remember him sitting across from my desk, pretty much like where you are looking at me now, and saying, "This case is back in my background check. Did you screw it up?" And of course, I did not screw it up. It was this phenomenon where LexisNexis, which had prepared a background check for him, looking for a seasonal job, had reported this case that was removed 20 months earlier. So we filed a dispute with LexisNexis. That is a channel that is required by the FCRA, so you will always have that option as well if you encounter this problem. And LexisNexis, as they had to, immediately said, "Oops, we made a mistake," and they took the case out of his background check and issued a new one to the staffing agency that he was hoping to find work through. Unfortunately, as often happens in these situations, once the cat is out of the bag, it's hard to put it back in. And so he did not get the job. So wanting to make sure that LexisNexis didn't have a bigger problem here, we assumed that they probably did and that expunge cases were getting through. I went down to my front door and around the corner to a law firm here in Philadelphia by the name of Francis and Mailman. It's a firm that does national work on FCRA background screening issues, and they'd probably be delighted to work with most of you. They practice in many, many states. We decided we would bring a class action for Mr. Gideon's, or with Mr. Gideon's as the named plaintiff, against LexisNexis to make sure that other people weren't being harmed by this error of reporting expunge cases, and also to seek compensation for those who had. And that essentially is what we did. And it turned out that the reason that LexisNexis had reported this case despite the lifecycle file is that they had not been running the lifecycle file. It sort of got dropped in some corner of their office, figuratively speaking. And by getting them to pay attention and run the file, they removed all the cases in Pennsylvania that had been expunged. So not only did we achieve something for Mr. Gideon's, and as part of the settlement, the Pennsylvanians whose expunge cases had been reported also received in the mail checks for $1,000, which I'm sure was a happy day of receiving the mail for them. They didn't even have to make a claim. We just mailed them checks for $1,000. But more important from the perspective of trying to make sure that people can find work, we fixed things going forward so that this will not happen again. with Pennsylvania criminal cases.
Well, that raises an interesting question probably for a lot of our viewers, many of whom work at programs that are funded in part by the Legal Services Corporation. And so, as we know, attendant to that, there are restrictions on class actions. Is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, is that still a good tool for them to use if they can't take that class action route?
Absolutely, because for one thing, it is an opportunity for you to recover significant damages for your client if there's not a private lawyer in your town who will do it. And frankly, FCRA lawyers are few and far between, not because it's really difficult, but because it's a kind of specialty statute. So if what you want to do is recover lost wages for your client, it's a lawsuit that you can file for the individual client. And hopefully, if your background screener doesn't want other people to come around and file class actions, they will say, oh, we really screwed up here. How can we fix this going forward? And it will have a bigger result than just your individual case.
Well, we just received a question from John at the University of North Carolina, and it's a different angle on this question. It's not something that you addressed in your advocacy story, but I want to see if you've run into this about background records tied to fingerprint checks. Does that come into play here? Is this all bundled together when we're talking about criminal records? Does that include fingerprint records?
That's an excellent question. That will not come up in private background screening company reports. They do not have access to fingerprint checks for the most part. There are some very specialized circumstances in which there may be fingerprints involved, like for daycare workers. If a state has contracted out their background screening to a private vendor, then they may involve fingerprinting. But primarily, these private screeners are preparing their reports solely from court data. And the match that they will usually make is based on a number of criteria: name, obviously, usually date of birth, and maybe other things like gender, address. But background screening with fingerprints tends to be either at it tends to be public record screening with the FBI records, with state police records, not generally with these commercially produced records.
Got it. And I'll remind our viewers that you too can ask us questions, submit something to Sharon. You can tweet that to us. Here's the hashtag to use at Shriver Center. Or if you're watching us through the Google Plus window, you can hover your mouse over the left side of the screen and click that Q&A box and type a question to us that way. We would love to hear from you. That's why Sharon's here. She wants to take your questions.
Yeah.
So we've had some developments on this front. You wrote the advocacy story that we published. This was earlier in the year. I think we published it in April. Have there been any developments in this area of the law since that time?
Yeah, there's been a really important one, which is that sort of out of the blue, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, the relatively new consumer agency created after the recession, issued a consent order against two very large related screeners, General Information Service and BackgroundChecks.com. And it was a very not only wide-ranging order that found a lot of practices that these two companies were using not to be up to par for compliance with the FCRA, but it also has very strong remedies associated with it. And one of the things that they found these companies did wrong was report expunged cases. They mentioned that they thought the companies had proprietary software that would have allowed them to identify expunged cases, and they required them to use it in every circumstance so that they can avoid reporting expunged cases where they can identify them. So I think the most important piece of this development is probably not the expungement specific piece, but the fact that the CFPB has very much appeared now as a strong enforcement agency that is going to be reviewing the work of the background screeners. Now, there are hundreds of background screeners in this country. There, in fact, so many of them and they're not regulated directly in a way that they have to register or anything. So we don't know how many even there are, but I think the estimate is in the 500, 600, 700 range. But even if the CFPB takes aim at the biggest screeners to see how they're doing their jobs, that's going to have a lot of really positive impact on people who are being screened for jobs all over the country.
I'd like to ask a practice question now for you. So let's say some of our viewers are representing someone, they help someone through this expungement process. Are there steps that they can take on the front end to reduce the likelihood that a record could pop back up later, even after it's been expunged?
So certainly one thing they can do is to send their expungement order to something called the Expungement Clearinghouse. Now, I can't speak to how well this works, honestly, but the idea behind it is that they can take your order and transmit it to about 500 different companies. So theoretically, that's putting them on notice that your case has been expunged and they better remove it from their data. So I would certainly recommend that if you're not lucky enough to be in Pennsylvania, where the courts are essentially doing the same thing, giving them notice, at least it is something you can do in other states. Also, if there is a company that you're particularly worried about, so for instance, here in Philadelphia, all of the senior housing background check reports are done by a company called RealPage. And I've had many clients had their expunged cases reported by RealPage. So I've taken to send, if I know somebody who's looking for senior housing actively, I send a copy of that order to RealPage. On all of these screeners' web pages, you can find usually at the bottom of their web page something that says a link for consumer interactions with them. That is where you'd go to figure out where to direct your expungement order.
So approach this from a different angle, from the employer side. I mean, certainly there are some employers who don't want to, pull up cases that have been cleared. They want to have the most accurate information possible. Is there a way to advocate with them? Is there a way to approach it from
Um,
that
the difficulty
side?
is that it's hard to send expungement orders to the hundreds of companies that exist. It's not like the big three credit reporters where you can just say, here you go, here's my information, here's my dispute. So I think the Expungement Clearinghouse is probably the best way to reach out to all of them. I will say that if you're speaking to employers who are looking to avoid this problem in the background checks that they buy, what I would recommend is that they actually look for screeners that verify the results of their data runs before they send out the reports. So for instance, there is an association, a loose affiliation of background screeners called Concerned CRAs. Mm-hmm. And those screeners have specifically said that they will pledge, as part of membership in that group, to verify their results by looking at court data, by sending a runner out to the court to verify the data before they send it out. If these companies were verifying the data, they would not be reporting expunged cases. Unfortunately, the biggest companies, your First Advantages, your LexisNexis, your Higher Rights, are less likely to do that than some of the smaller companies are.
Well, so we've talked about litigation channels. We've talked about the advocating or trying to put your state in touch with Pennsylvania to replicate the life cycle file. Are there other advocacy channels to be pursued here? Any sort of policy remedies?
Really, I think the life cycle file is probably the best policy remedy. I guess along the lines of policy and enforcement is if you file complaints with the CFPB, and I think there's a link in my article to how to do that, you then put them on notice that a particular company is doing it wrong. And then they can come in and do their broader investigation and potentially get a result like they did against GIS and backgroundchecks.com. So those are, and of course, class litigation is a way of getting to broader policy outcomes. So those would be the primary types of actions that I would recommend.
I'll remind our viewers our time is actually drawing to a close. This half hours always go very quickly. So if you do have a question for Sharon or a point that you would like to raise, please go ahead and do that now, so we can make sure to get that in before we wrap up. Sharon, do state enforcement agencies ever do anything on this front? We've talked about this CFPB. How about any state, even attorneys general or anything on the consumer protection angle?
I can't remember seeing any attorney generals deal with this particular issue. There have been a few that have dealt with background screeners, and there are a few states that have their own version of the FCRA, but very few. And that situation, as I understand, has been kind of frozen because of preemption issues, so that states can't really enact their own very well. So this is something that's probably more directly dealt with at the federal level than at the state level.
Well, I'd like to shift our focus for just a second here as we wrap up. I really appreciate all your comments about the expungement issue, but I want to ask you, I guess, on just about a Sharon Dietrich level, what's the big issue that you see coming up, whether it's about background checks or not? What's hot in your world of advocacy right now?
Well, the two things I'm most excited about are, number one, the clean slate idea that I told you about earlier in this half hour. We are working on taking that from an idea that we put in a paper to actual proposed legislation in Pennsylvania, and it's garnishing a lot of bipartisan support. It's also kicking around in Michigan and a few other states. So we're hopeful to really expand expungement very broadly so that hundreds of thousands of people can get their cases sealed up and out of the way without needing to find lawyers like us. And the second thing that's really exciting is that we're working on trying to get a subsidized jobs program together, both at the state and local level in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. And we think that that's a really important supplement for our clients who are not able to find private sector jobs. And also it's a place certainly where people with records could potentially more easily find jobs, but also others who have been closed out of the private labor market. So those are the two things I'm most excited about right now.
I can see why. Well, I want to thank you so much, Sharon, for being our guest today, and thanks to all of our viewers and to those of you who submitted the question, John in North Carolina. I appreciate that very much. You will receive an email, so will everyone who registered. So if you had colleagues who couldn't attend today, but they did register, they'll receive an email likely early next week that will have a link to the recording of today's conversation with Sharon so that they can watch that later. There will also be a link there to read her advocacy story that we published earlier this year. There are a couple other links in there that I'd like you to pay attention to. One is a link to a survey about this Hangout. We would love to have your feedback on this so we know types of events that we should schedule and plan in the future. The other is an invitation and a link to register for next month's Hangout, and I do hope you'll join me then. I will have a star-studded panel to talk about last year's term of the Supreme Court and its impact on access to the federal courts. So I'll have 4 guests next month: Mona Tawatau from the Western Center on Law and Poverty, Gary Smith from Legal Services in Northern California, Gilda Ford from the Center for Medicare Advocacy, and Jane Perkins from the National Health Law Program. So that should be entertaining as well as informative, and we'll talk about we'll recap last year's Supreme Court term. That will take place on Thursday, December 17th, same time as this one today, 1 o'clock Eastern Time and 10 o'clock Pacific. So as I said, you'll have a link in there to register. So again, Sharon, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. And let me invite people that if they're working on this issue, they're more than welcome to email me, and I'll try to help you move this issue forward in your state.
Thank you. So we'll include Sharon's contact information in that follow-up email as well. That's a great thing to remember. Thanks, Sharon. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. And I do hope I will see you in some fashion next month at our Hangout. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Amanda.